Here's the thing about Chuck Norris. The man spent 8 seasons rounding house, kicking criminals across the great state of Texas, built one of the most loyal fan bases in 90s television history, and then just stopped. The show ended in 2001, the credits rolled, and America collectively moved on. Except they didn't. Because 4 years later, in 2005, Walker, Texas Ranger came roaring back in the form of a TV movie called Trial by Fire. And the story behind that movie is so strange, so surprisingly dramatic, and so full of moments that make you go, wait, really? That it deserves its own roundhouse kick to the face. Hi, my name is Aaron, and this is Old TV Cinema. Let's set the scene. Walker, Texas Ranger premiered on CBS in April of 1993 and ran for 8 seasons. 8 seasons of Chuck Norris delivering justice with his fists, his boots, and occasionally a meaningful glance at the Texas horizon. The show wrapped up in 2001, and at the time, it wasn't exactly a surprise. The ratings had been sliding. CBS had other priorities. And while the finale wasn't the kind of send-off that made headlines, most people assumed that was that. Walker rode off into the sunset, and the television landscape moved on. But here's what makes this interesting. The show didn't end with a bang or a massive dramatic conclusion that tied everything up in a bow. It ended in a way that left fans feeling like someone had just walked out of a conversation mid-sentence. Which, as any veteran of this channel knows, is basically an invitation for a sequel nobody planned. So 4 years passed. The world changed. Reality television took over. And yet somehow, in 2005, Walker was back. Which raises the obvious question of how, exactly, a canceled CBS drama from the 90s managed to resurrect itself nearly half a decade after its last episode aired. Spoiler, it involves Chuck Norris being very, very determined, but more on that in a moment. Nobody expected Trial by Fire to do what it did in the ratings. Nobody, not CBS, not the producers, and probably not even Chuck Norris himself. Though I imagine he would never admit to being surprised by anything. The man has a reputation to maintain. When Trial by Fire aired on CBS in October of 2005, it drew somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 million viewers. Let that sink in for a second. This was a TV movie based on a show that had been off the air for 4 years, airing in an era when network television was already starting to lose ground to cable and DVDs. 15 million people sat down and watched Walker, Texas Ranger come back from the dead like it had never left. To put that in context, that kind of number in 2005 was not small. That was the kind of audience that made network executives sit up straight and start saying things like, "So, what would a series revival look like?" Which, as we'll get to later, they absolutely did start saying. The ratings were the kind of validation that you almost never get for a reunion project. Usually when a canceled show comes back for a TV movie, it's a modest performer that gives the fan base some closure and quietly disappears. Trial by Fire did not quietly disappear. It showed up, made itself at home, and reminded everyone that Walker's audience had been sitting there, waiting the whole time. This is the part of the story where Chuck Norris becomes the protagonist in his own behind-the-scenes drama, which honestly feels appropriate. Trial by Fire did not happen because CBS woke up one morning and decided the world needed more Walker. It happened because Chuck Norris wanted it to happen, and he pushed for it with the kind of relentless determination that, if you've seen basically any episode of the show, should surprise absolutely no one. Norris had been vocal after the cancellation about feeling like the show deserved a proper conclusion. He felt the finale hadn't given fans or the characters the ending they deserved, and he wasn't wrong about that. So, he campaigned for it. He had conversations with CBS. He worked with producers. He kept the idea alive through the kind of persistent advocacy that most canceled TV stars simply don't have the leverage or the energy to maintain 4 years after the fact. And eventually, CBS listened. Partly because the network had enough faith in the brand. Partly because the Walker fan base had been remarkably loud about wanting more. And partly because, well, you don't really say no to Chuck Norris if you can avoid it. I mean, that's just common sense. The fact that a single actor's personal conviction is what brought this movie into existence is genuinely unusual in the television industry. These things typically get driven by network strategy or a studio looking to monetize a property. Trial by Fire got driven by one man who wasn't ready to let his character go, and honestly, that's kinda great. Here's something that a lot of casual viewers didn't pick up on when Trial by Fire aired. This movie was not just about giving fans closure. It was also a very deliberate attempt to set up a new ongoing series. In the television business, this is called a backdoor pilot. You make a movie, you introduce new story elements. You leave enough threads dangling that if the ratings are good, you can slide right into a weekly show without anyone noticing the transition. And Trial by Fire checked every single backdoor pilot box. It introduced new characters that could carry ongoing storylines. It set up dynamics and conflicts that clearly weren't going to be resolved in a 2-hour window. It positioned Walker and Alex and Trevette in a way that suggested a future, not just a conclusion. The whole thing had the architecture of a series premiere wearing a reunion movie costume. Given that the ratings were massive, as we already talked about, CBS absolutely had conversations about turning this into something more. The fan response was there. The numbers were there. And Chuck Norris was clearly willing, but as with so many things in the television industry, willing and able are two completely different things. The series revival never materialized, which left Trial by Fire in this strange limbo where it was built to be a beginning but ended up being a conclusion, which is, depending on how you look at it, either frustrating or deeply poetic. I'm going to go with frustrating personally, but I respect the poetic interpretation. The writers crammed 8 years of loose ends into one movie. Okay, so imagine you have 8 seasons worth of storylines, character arcs, unresolved tensions, and dangling plot threads. Now, imagine you have roughly 2 hours to address all of them, while also telling a new story and setting up future storylines and reminding the audience why they loved this show in the first place. That's the creative challenge the writers of Trial by Fire signed up for. And honestly, it's kind of a miracle the movie is as coherent as it is. The script for Trial by Fire is doing an enormous amount of heavy lifting at all times. Walker and Alex's relationship arc, which had been a slow burn across the entire run of the series, needed to be acknowledged and move forward. Trevette's personal journey needed a chapter. The world of the Texas Rangers needed to feel both familiar and evolved after a 4-year gap. And on top of all of that, there needed to be a compelling villain, an actual plot, and enough action to satisfy the audience that showed up. Specifically, because they remembered Chuck Norris punching people in slow motion. The result is a movie that sometimes feels like it's running at about 1.5 times normal speed, narratively speaking. Things happen quickly, relationships advance rapidly, stakes get established fast. But given the constraints, it works. The writers made choices, committed to them, and delivered something that felt like Walker without feeling like a pale imitation of it, which, given how badly reunion projects can go, is genuinely worth acknowledging. Jimmy Trevette was as essential to Walker, Texas Ranger, as the cowboy hat and the roundhouse kick. The dynamic between Walker and Trevette, the classic pairing of the old-school Texas Ranger and the younger, tech-savvy partner, was the backbone of the show's character relationships for most of its run. So, when Trial by Fire was being put together, getting Clarence Gilliard back seemed like a non-negotiable. Except, it almost didn't happen. Gilliard, by 2005, had moved significantly into academic work. He had become a professor, specifically focusing on theater and film, and his priorities had shifted considerably from his acting career. Getting him back to reprise Trevette required real conversations and real convincing. This wasn't a case of an actor who was sitting by the phone waiting for the call. Gilliard had genuinely moved on to a different chapter of his life, one that didn't revolve around television production schedules. The fact that he came back at all is something fans should probably appreciate more than they typically do, because A Trial by Fire without Trevette would have been a fundamentally different movie. The banter, the partnership, the history between these two characters, that's not something you can replace with a new face and a quick introduction scene. Gilliard's return gave the movie an authenticity it absolutely needed, and apparently the conversations that got him there were significantly more complicated than anyone let on publicly. Okay, quick one here, but I genuinely love this too much not to spend a little time on it, so bear with me. Trial by Fire, that's the title they went with. a phrase that means a severe test of courage and endurance under intense pressure. The kind of phrase that sounds tough and action-ready, which is obviously why I got picked for a Chuck Norris vehicle. Put it on the poster, sounds great, nobody thinks too hard about it. Except when you actually stop and look at what this production went through just to exist, the title becomes this perfect, completely unintentional self-description that is almost too good to be true. A show that had been canceled and off the air for 4 years, trying to claw its way back to network television. A star who had to personally campaign, push, and advocate just to get his own project greenlit by the very network that used to air his show every week. A writing team handed the impossible task of cramming nearly a decade of unresolved storylines into a single 2-hour window. A network full of executives with cold feet, greenlighting something they genuinely weren't sure was going to work, crossing their fingers and hoping 15 million people remembered who Walker was. If any television movie in the history of the medium has ever more literally been a trial by fire in terms of its own behind-the-scenes existence, I would genuinely love to hear about it. Drop it in the comments because I am not aware of a better example. Sometimes a title just writes itself, or in this case, the production circumstances write it for you without anyone in the room even noticing, which might be the most Walker thing about this entire project. Here's something that gets glossed over in the warm, nostalgic glow of Trial by Fire's big ratings success. Before the movie aired, CBS was not exactly jumping up and down with confidence about it. The network had canceled Walker in 2001 for reasons, and those reasons didn't evaporate just because Chuck Norris wanted a movie. There was genuine internal uncertainty about whether a reunion project for a show that had been off the air for 4 years was a smart investment of resources and airtime. CBS's hesitation wasn't irrational, to be fair. The television landscape in 2005 was not the same one that Walker had thrived in during the 90s. Reality television had fundamentally changed what audiences expected from their weeknight viewing. Procedural dramas had evolved significantly. The idea of bringing back a character defined by a very specific 90s aesthetic and formula, cowboy hat, Texas setting, martial arts, wholesome values, and straightforward good versus evil storytelling was not an obviously safe bet. The network went back and forth on it. There were conversations about the budget. There were concerns about the time slot. There was the general corporate nervousness that comes with any project that doesn't fit neatly into the current programming strategy. That CBS ultimately said yes is as much a tribute to Chuck Norris's persistence and the demonstrated loyalty of the Walker fan base as it is to any kind of network confidence, because confidence initially was in short supply. Let's just take a moment to appreciate what is happening physically in this movie. Chuck Norris was born in March of 1940. Walker, Texas Ranger premiered in 1993 when Norris was 53 years old. He spent 8 seasons playing a Texas Ranger who regularly engaged in hand-to-hand combat, martial arts sequences, and physical confrontations with people who were often significantly younger than him. By the time Trial by Fire went into production, Chuck Norris was 65 years old, 65, and the man is still throwing kicks, still playing a character who resolves conflicts with his body as much as his badge, still convincing audiences completely, which is either a testament to his extraordinary physical conditioning, the miracle of careful camera work, or some combination of both, that nobody is going to examine too closely because it's more fun to just accept it. Norris's commitment to physical fitness is genuinely legendary, and it shows in Trial by Fire. He doesn't look like a man who should be slowing down, even if the action sequences are perhaps slightly more strategically constructed than they were in season 1 of the original series. I'm not saying anything, I'm just saying that good editing is a remarkable tool, and Chuck Norris's team knew how to use it. Either way, 65 years old and still Walker. That's the fact. Sit with that for a second. Trial by Fire was a CBS television movie made for a television movie budget. And in 2005, a television movie budget was not a theatrical film budget. I want to be very clear about this because the gap between what the movie wanted to be and what it could afford to be is occasionally visible in ways that are, let's say, charming. The action sequences are competent, but clearly not extravagant. The production design leans heavily on locations that were probably selected as much for cost efficiency as for visual appeal. Some of the supporting cast members are doing work that suggests their paychecks were, let's say, not enormous. And certain scenes have that particular quality that veteran TV movie watchers will recognize immediately. That slightly overlit, slightly too clean look that comes from shooting quickly on a limited schedule. None of this is a fatal flaw. Walker, Texas Ranger was never a show that dazzled you with production value. It dazzled you with Chuck Norris and with the comfortable, familiar rhythms of a show that knew exactly what it was. Trial by Fire understands this about itself and plays to its strengths rather than trying to pretend it's something it isn't. But if you go in expecting the production scale of, I don't know, a theatrical action film, you're going to need to recalibrate your expectations pretty quickly. Set them to 90s CBS drama level, and you'll have a fine time. Alright, this is one of my favorite parts of this whole story, because it's a genuinely remarkable example of a fan base refusing to accept that something was over. When Walker, Texas Ranger ended in 2001, the people who loved that show did not go quietly. This was the early days of internet fan communities, before social media made fan campaigns a standard part of the pop culture landscape. But Walker fans were ahead of the curve in terms of organized, persistent, loud advocacy. There were letter-writing campaigns, there were online petitions. There were fan sites dedicated specifically to pushing for more Walker content, whether that meant a revival, a movie, or literally anything that would bring the show back in some form. And here's the thing about the Walker fanbase that's easy to underestimate if you've never encountered it directly. This was not a small, niche group of extremely online enthusiasts. Walker had been a genuine mainstream hit for most of its run, which means its fan base was broad, demographically diverse, and included a lot of people who weren't typically the type to participate in fan activism. Regular television viewers, people who watched CBS because that's what they watched, people who genuinely loved this show and felt its absence. The volume and the persistence of the fan response after cancellation was a real factor in the conversations that eventually led to Trial by Fire. You can draw a direct line from the fans who kept pushing to the movie that eventually got made. In an era before fan campaigns regularly moved the needle on these kinds of decisions, Walker's audience managed to actually influence the outcome, and that's worth recognizing. One of the great unsung pleasures of Walker, Texas Ranger across its entire run, was the absolute dedication to creating villains who were not just evil, but spectacularly, operatically, almost joyfully over the top. The show had a long tradition of antagonists who behaved as though they had read a manual called How to Be a Bad Guy on Television and decided to perform every instruction at maximum volume. Trial by Fire continues this proud tradition with an antagonist who fits right into the Walker Villain Hall of Fame alongside some of the most gloriously theatrical bad guys the 90s produced. There's something almost refreshing about a villain in 2005 who operates according to the clear, straightforward rules of pre-anti-hero television evil. This person is bad. Walker is good. The confrontation will involve kicking. The outcome is not in question, but will be satisfying anyway. This is a feature, not a bug. The Walker formula worked because it never pretended to be morally complicated. The show knew what it was. It was a story about a good man stopping bad people. And the bad people needed to be bad enough to justify 8 seasons of roundhouse kicks. Trial by Fire honors that tradition completely, delivering a villain who is exactly as unhinged as the situation requires and not a single degree more subtle than necessary. God bless this franchise. Here's a fact that tends to surprise people who write Walker off as pure fantasy dressed up in a cowboy hat. The show, throughout its run, actually did a reasonably serious job of grounding its Texas Ranger mythology in real history and genuine institutional details about one of America's oldest law enforcement agencies. The Texas Rangers were established in 1823, making them one of the oldest law enforcement agencies in the United States, with a genuinely rich and complicated history. Walker the show engaged with that history more thoughtfully than you might expect from a CBS action drama. The traditions, the codes, the culture of the Rangers, the sense of individual responsibility and frontier justice that defines the institution, these weren't just decorative details. They were built into the DNA of the character and the show. Trial by Fire carries this forward. Walker's identity as a Ranger isn't just a job title in this movie. It's a worldview. And that worldview has real roots in something genuine, which is a weird compliment to pay to a Chuck Norris TV movie, but here we are, and I stand by it. Alex Cahill, the tough, principled assistant district attorney, played by Sherry J. Wilson, was Walker's love interest and eventually his wife across the run of the series. Her relationship with Walker was the emotional core of the show's human drama, which is a slightly elevated way of saying she was the person Walker looked at meaningfully before going to punch someone. Getting Wilson back for trial by fire seemed, from the outside, like a natural, uncomplicated decision. Of course Alex comes back. Of course Walker and Alex's story continues. What else would you do? But the behind-the-scenes reality was more layered than that. Wilson had moved on from the show, and from that chapter of her professional life, in ways that made her return something that needed to be negotiated carefully, both in terms of the practical logistics and in terms of how her character would be used and treated within the narrative. The question of where Alex stands at the start of trial by fire, what her arc looks like, how her relationship with Walker is framed after a 4-year gap in the story. These weren't decisions that got made quickly or easily. Wilson wanted Alex to be handled with respect and care. She wasn't interested in coming back just to stand in the background while Walker punched people. The negotiations around her return shape significant parts of how the movie is structured and what it decides to focus on dramatically. The result is that Alex feels present and active in trial by fire rather than ornamental, which is the outcome everyone wanted but wasn't guaranteed. And here's where we land, and honestly, where the whole story gets a little bittersweet. Trial by Fire was, as of the time of this video, the last time Chuck Norris put on the cowboy hat and played Cordell Walker. The movie that was designed as a backdoor pilot, the 2-hour event that was supposed to be a new beginning, ended up being a conclusion. Not a conclusion anyone planned, and not a conclusion that felt complete in the way a final chapter is supposed to feel complete, but a conclusion nonetheless. The series revival that Trial by Fire was supposed to set up never happened. CBS had the ratings data, they had the demonstrated audience appetite, and they ultimately decided not to move forward with a new Walker series. The reasons were probably a combination of budget considerations, scheduling complications, and the general network calculus that governs these decisions. And that rarely has much to do with whether the audience actually wants something, because clearly the audience wanted it, and so Walker, Texas Ranger, ended twice. Once in 2001, when the series wrapped up without the send-off it deserved, and once in 2005, when a movie that was supposed to be a new beginning quietly became the final chapter instead. Chuck Norris has spoken about Walker over the years with obvious affection. It's clear the character meant something real to him, and it's clear the show's audience meant something real to him. The fact that Trial by Fire exists at all is because he fought for it. The fact that it ended there is because television is a business, and businesses make decisions that don't always align with what the fans and the creators actually want. There's something genuinely poignant about that if you sit with it long enough. A man fighting to bring back a character he loves, succeeding against real odds, delivering a movie that 15 million people watched, and still not being able to get the network to take the next step. Walker deserved a better ending than that. And Chuck Norris deserved the series revival he clearly wanted. But maybe that's what keeps the legend alive. The things that don't get finished have a way of staying with us longer than the things that do. And that's 15 weird facts about Walker, Texas Ranger, Trial by Fire. A TV movie that probably shouldn't exist, definitely shouldn't have gotten 15 million viewers, and somehow ended up being one of the more quietly fascinating reunion projects in 90s television history. If you learned something today, or if I just sent you down a rabbit hole of Walker episodes you're now gonna rewatch this weekend, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to Old TV Cinema. We do this every week: forgotten shows, failed spin-offs, disappeared characters, and the genuinely strange stories behind the television that raised a generation. Drop a comment and tell me, were you one of the 15 million people who watched Trial by Fire when it aired? Or did you just find out this movie exists in the last 10 minutes?